Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. This is Ramesh. Hope you guys are doing well. It's been a while, but I'm finally back with another podcast. And on today's video, my guest is basically somebody who's had a successful career in law, in academic law, and who gave it up for spiritual and artistic development. He's a very prolific writer, speaker, and artist, originally from Ireland, and I believe currently based in Sweden. It is my pleasure to introduce James Tunney. James, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for joining. How are you doing?
Great, thank you very much, Ramesh. It's great to talk to you, and it seems particularly nice to talk to someone in a place connected with Sri Aurobindo. That's a nice connection too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this chat because so just to give a little background, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Jeffrey Mishlow, and I've been following his YouTube channel, New Thinking Aloud, and I can't believe that I've been watching him for such a long time without realizing that. I mean, one of those YouTube algorithm magic when it threw up one of your videos, and I went to his playlist, and there's like 40 or 50 videos featuring James Tunney speaking on like a host of different, like such diverse topics. And I must confess, I haven't listened to all of them, and I haven't read all your books yet. I mean, there's a ton of material, but I found myself resonating with your views quite a bit on many, many different topics. And on this channel, I try to discuss things which have to do with consciousness and nature of reality and maybe non-human intelligence and well, the last few videos have also been about specifically about aliens and UAP and things like that.
Yes.
Uh, so a lot of like topics that sort of reveal the true nature of reality and how it's not what people take it to be. So I thought it'd be good to invite you on the channel, and I'm so happy you came on. By the way, you're the third Irishman to come on the channel, or somebody of
Yeah.
Irish descent.
Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
Dr. Colm Kelleher and Dr. Eamon Arnsbro, the astrophysicist.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting gentleman.
Yeah. So before I proceed, just to give a little introduction, so I'll put a link to his website and his Amazon page in the description below. But James is a author of many articles and a lot of different books. He's written books on, so I'll just read out a few titles: The Mystery of the Trapped Light, The Mystical Accord, a book on poetry, mystical murmuration, and quite a few books on AI and
Yes.
post-humanism and
Yeah.
humanism. And one topic which really I found very curious, then we'll probably touch upon it soon, which is scientism and scientocracy. So a whole bunch of topics, including, like anomalous phenomena, personalities, authors like H.G. Wells and Philip K. Dick, and yeah. So I will let the viewer go and check out your website and the
Yes.
book list. There's so much of rich content. So I want to begin by asking, first of all, is there any topic that you have not dwelt on?
That's an that's an interesting topic. Well, dwelt on in the sense of developing on that. There are certain topics I kind of leave alone. It's not that I'm not interested in them. I don't go into so much into UFOs, for example. It's not that I'm not interested in them, but there's an active field, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So one has to be also careful, unless one is willing to. If you look at Eamon Ansbro and the level of detail he's engaged in, it's
Right.
silly for people sometimes to enter these areas, without that background. So it's not that I'm not interested in them; it's that I try and not speak too much about topics I don't know about. Not that I don't have very strong views on them. So that would be the qualification. I think I notice in this age of the internet and the nature of talk shows, I'm not talking about this context, but in a general talk show, is people are presumed to have knowledge about everything in the same degree, and you don't know when they move from an area of expertise to an area that they know nothing about. There's a kind of seamless movement sometimes without their qualification. So that would be the
Right.
only caveat.
Yeah. I remember that somebody at some point said, like, you don't have to have an opinion on everything under the sun, you know.
Yes, exactly. I think that's important. Yeah.
Um, so so basically, I guess I want to start off then with I know so one of my core areas of interest is the nature of reality and consciousness, and so I'll get to that. But then I want to ask your opinion on what do you feel is happening to humanity now? Where are we headed? Because conspiracy theories aside, I guess most people that I speak to agree that there is a sense of sort of a grim foreboding, like where there's a lot of social upheaval and unrest across much more than usual happening across the world, and adverse weather events happening across the world, coinciding with the rise of AI and all these like sudden, developments in technology that are like fantastic. And I know you didn't want to go into UFOs, but then for people who follow that topic, there's also been a lot of revelations coming out and a lot of developments in that field as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you feel like humanity is headed towards like an interesting half a decade of maybe not apocalyptic outcome, but something very on the brink of
Yeah.
something?
I should qualify what I've said about UFOs. It's just that I tend not to lead on those topics. It's not that I don't discuss them, and I'm very interested in the discourse. It's just that question about leadership and what areas you can uh, think you lead on, your strong suit, if you like. So I have a deep interest, and it is it's a very important part, certainly in relation to the nature of reality, and certainly in relation to geopolitical reasons as well, and also the possibility of fraud by authorities. That's another element. So it's very, very important to know what's happening. So even so, one can understand those topics. To people that don't, without going through long explanations that I have given in other contexts, let me explain in simple terms, perhaps linking where you are now and where I am now in the story to explain how these things are interleaved. When my father was born, Ireland was part of the British Empire. And in that sense, he was part of the same political institution in the country that you are in now. And this is the thing that people forget. They were ruled in the same system, So,
Commonwealth.
no, in the empire
Oh yeah.
before the Commonwealth.
Okay.
So my father was born in 1918. So that's people forget how radically the world has changed. So we know about, if we take the example of Sri Aurobindo and his movement from his anti-colonial struggle, because people forget about India because it's so big and it's a massive history and it has an imperial past, that in this context it's the colony. So people forget about that. So insofar as they had an experience of a battle for independence. It mirrored exactly what was going on in Ireland, and Ireland, in many senses, was ahead of that because they'd been in it longer, in the game longer. So it's quite remarkable when you look at Sri Aurobindo. His knowledge of Irish politics was very deep, kind of remarkable. So he was very aware of what was happening, as were a lot of the leaders in India, and they were very influenced. So not just him. For example, one of my father's uncle was in jail, and I used to talk to some of these that were alive. So they were in jail a lot of time in a struggle for independence, in armed struggle. And one of the person in charge of one of my father's uncle's dormitory when they were taken prisoner over to Wales was Terence MacSweeney, and he led a hunger strike in 1920. He went on hunger strike as a playwright, Lord Mayor of Cork, and he died after 73 days. Now that hunger strike was hugely influential on people in India, not least Gandhi. They were looking at what happened. So we had the War of Independence and the treaty negotiations in the 20s, which were critical. And this is important to understand it, to not talk about conspiracy, to look at the historical evidence. So what happened in the 1920s, according to my view? So they had these negotiations, and some of the people that my family were involved with were there at the table, Arthur Griffith and that. So I mean, I can read in my memoirs of my father's uncle, and they're being taken prisoner in a cattle boat, and some of these guys are in the boat with them, and even though they're in the boat and they're revolutionaries, uh, in the dark at 11 o'clock at night before they go to bed, they're saying the rosary together.
Mm.
The deep Catholic spiritual
Right.
thing, which I want to emphasize as well. in Ireland was heavily interleaved with the pre-existing culture which had existed for thousands of years in the island. The Catholicism never displaced the pre-existing thing. It was more of a syncretic approach. So,
Was it the Celtic or the Gaelic?
yeah,
My knowledge is not so
yeah.
good in that.
So there was the Gaelic culture. It was the culture that Yeats, from the Protestant ascendancy, realizes has an ancient tradition. And this is where he gets all his knowledge of
Transcendental poetry,
yeah, and of the fairies and the other world, because a
right?
lot of these people couldn't see any of these things. But they and that's where Evans Wentz, for example, who comes over to gets involved in the translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, comes to Ireland first because he's interested in the fairy faith of the Celtic people. So there was this channel that had happened in the intelligentsia in the 1880s, Yeats and Russell, etc., who met with through the theosophical movement with visiting Indian scholars, and therefore were introduced to the sacred texts from India, as they had been done, had happened a bit earlier as well. So there's this interest in cross fertilization. But in the 20s, the British government changed its view. It began to realize that it couldn't deal with a whole load of armed struggles around the world. And so therefore, and also Churchill 100 years ago began to understand that there could be something like an atomic bomb, because H.G. Wells had talked about it. They talked about this. So it's clear if you read the work of H.G. Wells in particular, who was a student of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was the Darwin's bulldog, that we have a stream which came from evolutionary theory, eugenics, biological determinism, imperialism, which came up to the 1920s when they said, we cannot manage our empires in this way. So what happened then was a transition in the 1920s, evident in the work of J.D. Bernal, The World of Flesh and the Devil, Haldane, Birkenhead, and Lord Birkenhead, who wrote about the world and the future as a futurist, was negotiating this treaty with the Irish as well. So they're very much involved in this process. It's very closely related. And this would ultimately lead to Churchill, the same chap, in 1943, saying the next empire will be the empire of the mind. So in the 1920s, they decided, in my view, the Anglo-American English-speaking world power structures, that they were going to take over the world. It's quite clear through the documentation. You can see it in Toynbee's speech in London, again at the same time as in the 40s, which influenced Arthur C. Clarke, that the
Mm.
Anglo-Americans English-speaking world was going to set up a scaffolding for world governance. They felt some entitlement. This goes back to this sense, the imperial sense. Nothing got to, it's not really related to race. For example, the Irish weren't regarded as the same race as the English in many senses. They were regarded in a similar way as they would look at people from other countries. It's not really determined by race. There's a book called, I think it's Ornamentalism, explaining that it's really about whether you will come into the power structure, whether you're going to succumb to this power structure. And then they don't care, who you are and where you come from. This is an illusion that they have also perpetrated. So basically they decided that they were going to control the human mind. And they had knowledge to do so. If we go back, we can look at Benjamin Franklin, we can look at this interest in governance and governance of the human body, in particular through electricity. Once we see this trend from Aldini, Galvani, and all these people that understood that if you put electricity into the body, you could get a reaction. They began to say, oh, well, we can control the human body. This is a standard or clear obsession that they have. So in the 1960s, in the context of cybernetics, you have books by Deutsch talking about the nerves of government. So we came to a situation from that trajectory where they said we can achieve global governance using systems like NATO, which are not purely defensive, And if you look at the documents that are supposed to have informed, or the books that are supposed to have informed NATO, they say clearly that we have to prepare for the machine, that we have to prepare the world for the machine. This is it's unbelievable. So H.G. Wells had laid out the plan that there was going to be an open conspiracy. So that's the name of his book. It's not a secret. It's called The Open Conspiracy. It's a book. It's open.
Right.
And it's called The New World Order. And the New World Order was going to be global control by a scientific elite based on biological control. So once you say, I'm going to control the human body, well, then you can forget all about spirituality. And in this agenda, they say we're going to abolish the family, we're going to abolish religion, and we're going to abolish the nation state. And they're doing very well on that. So they're being very, very successful. So the idea is to achieve global governance. It's not English or British, it's a cosmopolitan elite that formed out of those power structures
Right.
that will assimilate anyone that's willing to be involved in that goal. It doesn't matter, they don't have to understand. There's concentric circles of interest, but this is what they have consistently said. So the inevitable movement is to a dispirited world where the human is initially, say, we start off with the electronics out there, then we get the electronics we carry around, the telephone, and then it comes in the body. So
Right.
once it comes in the body, and they can do it in a number of means. They've been working on this for a long time through crystals, not through a big hole in your head, but through crystals, nanotechnology, interacting with the electromagnetic system. Well, then they can suppress people, they can affect behavior, they can monitor behavior, they can create a data-rich environment. And that's the clear implication. We can see it being manifested in groups like the World Economic Forum, but people's focus on the World Economic Forum means that they're not focusing on the World Trade Organization and the corporate takeover of governance, for example. So really what's happening is, and this is the paradox, that the same struggle that Aurobindo was involved in and changed his mind in, and the same struggle that happened in Ireland is ongoing. It never
Right.
went away. The British Empire didn't disappear. It dissipated into economics, commercial structure, transnational corporations, and international organizations, with the objective that it could use a whole range of techniques, multilateral, through a whole range of interest groups, to lead to this situation. And in the various books or in his fiction, H.G. Wells explains or indicates that they're willing to destroy the world to get there. There's a kind of Promethean man motif, which we can
Right.
see from Karl Marx up to the Manhattan Project. Prometheus is the symbol of this organization, and that Promethean man, as Sayed Hossein Nasser explains, this idea of Promethean man or woman is a contrast to this spiritual idea that the human is the pontifex between heaven and earth. And it was anticipated in Sri Aurobindo's critique of Nietzsche in relation to the Superman. He said, no, yeah, we can have a Superman spiritually, but not this type of Superman, not this type of materialist Superman. So they're all in the same thing. But the key shift is, so what is happening is that this system is a product of a biological determinism, materialism, all that imperialism, a particular worldview, which doesn't recognize the spirit. So the cause of it is this lack of recognizing the spirit. And the solution comes from spiritual engagement and mysticism. And that's why at this stage as well, because the threat is to all spirituality, that people have to move, not disregard their compartment, but take what's from there and be able to cooperate at a higher level to
Right.
resist this encroachment by technology. So I hope it didn't go on too long
No,
in
no, I
that
think it
analysis.
set an excellent base for the points that I was about to bring up. So basically, so this has been in the making for a long time, as you say. So, but why now? Why does it look like it's like ramping up suddenly? There's like an exponential, like a multi-pronged attack. It's like there is a sense of urgency. Like what's like do you feel like it's just gone up much, is happening much accelerated in a
Yeah,
way?
because they have been very successful. They've been very successful, and they believe now that the game is nearly over, so that they're moving into a checkmate position. That's what I believe. So therefore, we have more hubris, more in your face element of it. And it's like it's like in say you're doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu or judo, and you know you have your arm around the person's throat,
Right.
and you know when that happens, or if someone has their arm around your throat, you know you're in trouble. You could be a few seconds away from going to sleep. So
Right.
either you defend successfully or you don't, or you tap or something. So they're in that kind of position, that kind of end game thing, because all these different things were done. They have successfully, for example, undermined the institutions of Catholicism, which you know some argue has been an infiltration program from the 1850s. There's long arguments about this, but there's quite a lot of evidence that that has been successful. That these groups can control from the top uh, different organizations. So what you think is on your side is not on your side. But when you
Mm.
begin to look at is this promoting the things that they want and reducing the obstacles to them, family, religion, nation state, you can see that a lot of policies inform that. And then, of course, if you look at the as Dostoevsky understood when he went to the great exhibition, he said there's something kind of associated with Baal or Moloch here. There's something dark about all this technology. And from then, if you look at the British sea routes, if you look at the East India Company, the opium trade, the tea trade, these were the lines on which the global telecommunication system was set up. So they're building it through the post system and then through the telecommunications system from the 1850s onwards. So they weren't doing that. Why do you think, or does one think that they're putting these cables, the
Right.
telegraph cables,
Right.
so people can communicate, they're for strategic interest. They say that when they're building the railroads in Africa to get the diamonds and the gold in South Africa, they say it's a titanic struggle that we're engaged in. Titan, Prometheus, this is whatever. So the telecommunication system for 170 years at least, and before that, because if you look at the secret interception systems, we go back to the Black Chambers in France in the 1400s. We're talking about New World Order. We're talking about orders. We're talking about collections of people. People forget about
Right.
that. Associations of these are hundreds of years old in the Norman systems. So why it's ramping up now is that really all the ingredients are in place to be able to control us, to control everything that we do, to watch everything that we do. The prison system is nearly here and nearly universal. That the whole planet is gone. And we remember that, as the experts say about DARPA in the United States, they're 20 years ahead. So
Mm.
they're 20 years in the future, really looking at us. And for example, I'm writing about smart dust and neural dust. We don't know that the world hasn't been coated with, you know, multiple, a huge amount of sensors so that they can see everything. And there's a fair bit of evidence that that's what's happening. They've been doing it in weather balloons since the 1950s. These are acknowledged, and no conspiracy. They're from official documents. They've been messing with the weather from the 40s they began, and in the 60s in Vietnam, etc. And this has gone on in a number of countries. So there's no mystery. What we do have is a growth in the belief that humans can inflict their will on the earth. And this is a kind of sorcerous, kind of magic Nietzschean view that Aurobindo criticized. So this view has become predominant because spirituality is being suppressed and ridiculed and mocked and all times and not understood. And precisely because people don't accept the ontological reality. Sometimes in relation to UFOs, one point I would make is there's a lot of people are willing to believe in UFOs because they're tangible and materialistic, or they seem material, and therefore they can believe in that, but they can't
Right.
believe in something that they can access with their own mind. But really, this world that we can access with our own mind is the and spirit, our spiritual consciousness is the key.
Right. And do you think these, the outbreak of these pandemics are also part of the plan? Like it's engineered pandemic to sort of control
Yes,
and
yes.
move the world population and bring them under control and so
Yes,
on.
and there's books written about the political use of mass migration. Yes, I've written about that in relation to plantation. There've been the plantation system, using it in Ireland. People forget about the Irish context, planting groups, different population, different interests, divide and conquer. You know about that in Indian history,
Right.
and this idea of plantation. So now we're moving from plantation of people and crops to or control of crops to implantation, because the field of battle is in human consciousness itself. And that's why Aurobindo was right to shift. That's why, and same with my family, they moved into constitutional politics and ultimately ended up, in the peace negotiations or helping the peace process in Northern Ireland. But so Aurobindo was recognizing that the spiritual, and with Vivekananda and he's recognized the influence as well. He's recognizing that ultimately it's a spiritual battle, and you
Right.
cannot fight a spiritual battle with material things. There may be those, everyone has a right to self-defense, etc. Now, put that aside, and the anti-colonial movement legally as well. Put that aside. Ultimately, if the people are spiritually impoverished at the end, they won't be able to build anything. If you look at Eamon de Valera, who I met when I was small, and he was sentenced to death, or in a small place, he was sentenced to death in 1916. I just met him getting out of a car when I was a boy, but he lived till he was old. But you're bearing in mind that these are the figures that were, sentenced to death by these institutions, and involved in negotiations with them, and who were influencing people like Gandhi and that, or
Yeah.
in communication with them. And his vision, which is ridiculed, absolutely ridiculed now, was of an Ireland which was happy, frugal, and concentrated on things of the spirit. Now that has been absolutely ridiculed for the last two generations. This is a target of speech which is meant to be so absurd. It's the exact same vision that Gandhi was propagating. It's a realization about, that it's a bigger thing that we're talking about. So the solution is in the spirit. It's a spiritual process, and it's about the spirit of the people who are behind this as well. So I mean, because it's misguided, wrong, some people say evil, depend whatever. It doesn't matter. There's an advocacy thing to them. So that's the root, and that's the solution.
Right. So I was going to come to that next about spirituality and how consciousness comes into this in the picture. But before that, I just wanted to mention you spoke of technology being implanted into humans. So an interesting point is I also interviewed Dr. Kevin Warwick on the channel. He is, I think,
Yes, yes, yeah,
considered one of the world's first cyborgs to introduce a chip and communicate across the internet with his wife and so on. So that was an
great.
interesting podcast as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But just
Um,
one point, for example, 3.5 years ago when I did a live stream with Jeffrey Mishlove on this New Thinking Aloud, I uh, I said something about the next or the next crisis would probably or monkeypox or something. That was 3.5 years ago. So
Prophetic
in
words.
relation to yeah, I mean in relation to crystal ball, when you begin to look at the patterns, you begin to identify, and so if I say in December, well, that we could have a war in Ukraine this year, as happened, well, you say, well, okay, well, it becomes predictable. And when the thing becomes predictable, you can see the pattern, or if you get the pattern, you can see what happens, and you can match your hypothesis with reality. Well, then there's something more to it. It's not just speculation. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, no, no. So I get your point. So in a way, you're refusing to be distracted by what's being dangled in front of
Yes.
you, and you're looking behind it and sort of,
It's the
trying to
basis of all
get a sense of,
spiritual.
yeah,
It's the basis of all spiritual insight. It's the basis of all spiritual perception. It's what all the gurus and with siddhis, whatever, are telling us about illusion. It
yeah,
doesn't mean that life itself is an illusion. It means that we're in a constructed counterfeit world. It doesn't denigrate the importance of spiritual consciousness. It reaffirms it. Yeah.
right. Like it's interesting you mentioned that word like siddhis and the seers because in Sanskrit there is a specific phrase called viveka or the ability to discriminate, to
Yes.
know
Yeah.
what is actually being presented is it what it is or something else, to be able to get that sense of that.
There's also an interesting connection, I think, between siddhis and she, and the way the word is written, spelt the same way as well in relation to describe the fairies from the Irish language, because
Okay.
there's believed to be a very close connection between the origins of the Irish Gaelic language and Sanskrit. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. Are you familiar with David Abrams and the whole? So David Abrams, I think he comes from the whole like Gaia theory movement about the Earth as one whole organism, and humanity is just like one like part of that spectrum. And there's a continuous spectrum of life in all different forms. And his book, which I recommend to people who are watching, is Spell of the Sensuous, which I found really fascinating. Where he, among many other things, he makes the point how in the beginning of evolution, humanity, we used to interact, the human mind used to interact with nature, and we used to commune with nature all the time. You look at plants and trees taking cues from animals and weather and everything. And so you were so sort of uh, clued into that matrix of the biosphere. And then slowly they sort of disengaged from nature and started only exclusively interacting with other humans and treated nature as something like an inert and passive background meant to be exploited and taken from without permission. And at some point when technology came in, we've stopped the community, and now the human consciousness is almost exclusively interacting with just tech. And it's almost as if the consciousness is being sort of enmeshed and slowly but insidiously being trapped in a technosphere, as opposed to a biosphere. And it's very interesting because it sort of matches uh, what you just said. Like it's in terms of like if you're not careful and discriminate about what you choose, you may sort of slip into this whole and be an unwilling sort of participant of in this
Yeah.
whole setup.
What the objective is to make you a component of the system, so that
Right.
you can be altered. This is in the executive orders in the United States, so that you can be edited as you are a machine, deleted by artificial intelligence. That's in the official documents. That's in the published executive orders from Biden, for example. So that's not, again, fantasy. Both my parents were born on farms, and Ireland wasn't industrial developed. In fact, it was a few hundred years behind other countries in Europe because it was a colony. So, therefore, when I'm talking to my aunt, for example, who's still alive, she would have come from a context which is very close to the very, if you like, peasant. I'm not saying that in a derogatory sense, but very close to the land, very poor.
Right.
And she would talk about communicating with the rocks and things like that people would find strange. Well, it's strange unless you look at spiritual traditions and things like that. The point being is that in these people themselves, up to very recently in Ireland, there was a deep continuity of tradition which was ancient. So it didn't actually change in Ireland. So what we've had in the last generation in particular is a massive dislocation. And that's the word, dislocation. And it's dislocating people from it's probably the biggest connection, movement of people from the land to the cities. Because once you move people from the land to the cities, you cut that connection. You cut with the past, with animals, with stones, with ancestors, where you see things that are thousands of years old in Ireland, and there was someone there, and they existed, they left a message, they communicate in symbols, they had capacity to make great things, they communicate with the stars, they understood about the stars, they had a degree of sophistication. And the model, the propaganda of this system is utterly consistent. The past was bad. The past was depressing. The past, and I don't believe in that. I believe that that's propaganda. Of course, you can pick out things, but you can pick out loads of bad things now that they don't take ownership from. So you have this process of dislocation, demoralization, dispiriting. That was a specific strategy associated with Thomas Huxley and the X Club, 1863, 1864, to take spirit out of the equation in London. And London is a connection between Ireland and a place where they met, where Yeats could interact with the Indian poets, for example, Tagore, and all that crossover and cross-fertilization. So yes, we're moving into the thing. It's going to be so intense. There's lockdowns, all that kind of stuff helps. You become dependent on electronic access to the world, and through what I call endosymbiosis, the system comes into you, and then it's over. then your soul cannot. People say, oh, well, there'll still be something. If you are physiologically possessed, it will be impossible not to be possessed in the fullest sense. If you
Right.
succumb to that, that's the Mephistophelian pact, because convenience, or you say you have no other choice, you're making a decision to give over, in my view, at that point, when it crosses to the point where we want it in your system, or, now, this, of course, could be surreptitious, as it's kind of suggested by people like Yuval Noah Harari, when he's saying, well, actually, the COVID pandemic was the turning point, and this changed everything in relation to biometrics. You kind of reading between the lines, you think it has happened already. But in relation to the steering of the human, which is what cybernetics is. So cybernetics, steering, going back to the Greeks, who are always celebrated, although we're talking about a continuity also of a slave-owning class
Right.
throughout history. And people think slavery is over. No, slavery is just going to become a massive program. But
Right.
it's slavery where we like our servitude, or we're convinced that we like it because of this this engagement of sensation, or the sensation of the spirit, or the physiology of it is what's important. The last point about Gaia, I'm very disposed towards that. There's a problem. A lot of the Gaia discourse and deep ecology leads to a place where the human is not only not respected, but they're eradicated. And this is a
Mm.
perverse element of it. So we have to be careful. If you look at human flourishing, we say human flourishing, that's fantastic. If we said to Gandhi in favor of human flourishing, he'd say, yeah, that's great. But in deep ecology, human flourishing is the reduction of human population. It's an
Right.
inversion. So a lot of this Gaia thing, yes, and that emphasizes the traditional, say in the Irish context, the Earth Mother. But where is the Father in this? It's taken out of it, because what we're getting is the Father of the technosphere still, or some other Father, or some eradicant, some male lion that eats its children. We're getting a Promethean vision that doesn't make sense. In some of these ideas that purport to want to honor nature, it's fundamentally post-human. It's so that the human can be eradicated. And there's a lot of people being marshaled into that, believing that they're protecting some kind of pristine idea at the expense of human. That's what post-humanism involves. It purports to be. So I'm not saying that about the people that you mentioned. I'm just
Yeah.
saying it is a qualification on loving nature to the exclusion of humans. We have to get the balance right. And the people that are advocating this massive population control are the same power structures that have caused the problem. If we're all sitting at home spinning like Gandhi said, or what De Valera said, we wouldn't be having these problems. All of these problems are caused by the people, and they have the solution. So the people that said, all of these fathers of AI, they say, we didn't understand that AI was going to be so dangerous. Now that this is, it's a lie, or it's absurd, or it's propaganda. It cannot be true.
Right.
Everyone, everyone knew that this was a concept. Arthur C. Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey. They knew, of course, it was an implication. So then they say the solution to this now is that you must give us more money, so we can help solve the problems. And then, of course, this regulation produces more regulation of the human. So AI is a product of the military-industrial complex. Of course, we could create AI with a servant. It's not meant to be the servant, it's meant to be the master. They're claiming that AI will replace God. All spiritual people must take this seriously. When the promoters of artificial general intelligence are saying they are creating God, you must take it seriously, whatever your conception of God is. They mean to do that. They mean to displace any other concept by dragging us to make us into machine. As Bernal explained, the human would be turned to silicon. 1920s, common reading for people like Churchill, etc.
Right. So you believe that so I get your point about the Gaia theory, and somehow it can sort of go into the other extreme that we need
Mm.
to be aware of.
Mm.
But then coming back to this point, this interesting point you made somewhere in between, you believe that there is a point of no return where it will become irredeemable, like if you let
Yes,
it happen and the
yeah,
spirit.
yeah, I do.
Okay.
I do. If say you're Mahatma Gandhi, we'll take the example of, and we manage to inject you with chemicals, we lock you up in a room and inject you with chemicals. It, it's difficult. You
Right.
cannot. We could work on you to lead you to be a different person. So if Mahatma Gandhi consented to that process, so there was a consent to it, like a pact, and for some strange reason, there's no doubt that they would be able to chemically alter his brain in certain circumstances so that he wouldn't be able to operate normally. The principle applies equally to us, so the power of actual physiological control of the brain will make it impossible for for spiritual evolution, and a thing
Right.
that Aurobindo is talking about. This is what we have to do. It will
Right.
cap that and cause degeneration. And this is a key concept that people forget about in evolution. That Julian Huxley and talking about his biological synthesis, they talked about degeneration. There is a lot of spiritual degeneration happening. If you look at Rudolf Steiner, he predicted the destruction by medical means of the spiritual capacity. So
Mm.
you can see it. If we expose people to all negative influences in a particular side, they're going to become. It's going to be very, very difficult, extremely difficult, to evolve a spiritual path. There may be an intervention, whatever, but in general terms, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to spiritually evolve. The implication in the natural order of things, or in the divine order, is that it's the long road to hell, the slow thing that C.S. Lewis talked about in the move to Scientocracy. That he has the devil in the Screwtape Letters arguing for. That every little step we're doing, technologically, exposing, bit by bit, it's all moving in the same direction. And it's all moving away from autonomy, control, interdependence, exercise of human function, exercise of care directly, exercise of compassion, exercise of all those qualities that define us. So these
Right.
things about exercising care and compassion, they're not epiphenomenon, they are the phenomenon of the human being itself. And yes, I believe that once that happens, the mass system would potentially do that, subject to the one proviso that I believe that there will be an intervention, if you like. That's at some stage.
I grew up in a very classical Advaita non-duality background, which holds that there is the one consciousness or God or Paramatman or whatever you want to call it, from which everything has evolved. So, from that point of view, both Advaita, non-duality, and even like traditions like Kashmiri Shaivism, which I'm really fascinated by, they all talk of this field of consciousness which is untouchable, unalterable, and perfect in itself, from which everything has descended.
Yes.
And whatever we see, the play of duality and the play of evil and good, and I mean this is not a negation of evil. There is definitely bad things happening and evil things happening,
Mm.
but everything ultimately is a form, like a play in which like different
Mm.
roles have been assumed of this ultimate consciousness, which is just featureless. So it's interesting for me when you say that it is irredeemable and there's a point where this can be a degeneration. uh, uh, you know I feel, when I go back to this model of what I grew up in of Advaita, in my heart I feel like in every situation there is salvation. Like no matter what situation you are at, maybe there's a concept of avatar, as they say in Bhagavad Gita or whatever, or in Hinduism. When a situation goes beyond the tipping point, something else comes down from this ultimate consciousness, which forces people to like come into a different state or something. That's just my view. But then, like Aurobindo's integral yoga that you mentioned. So yeah, so he believed in this whole sort of descent of the divine into the flesh, and which makes the flesh more, like the humanity is not a last rung of evolution, and we must all work towards bringing down the divine and spiritual into the body and flesh and sort of evolve in that fashion. So it's
Yeah.
just like an interesting counterpoint. Like when you mentioned that it's sort of irredeemable, maybe I'm not sure. Maybe I
Yeah.
feel like there is still hope.
This is the nub of the issue. This is the issue that I wanted to, that intuitively I think is the critical one, where there is a difference and where there is a very, very important point. And this may be the issue for the rest of your life or my life, that we have to solve this issue. This is critical. So if Sri Aurobindo is saying, therefore, that the only evolution is on this plane, we come to a different position. We come to a position closer to the technosphere context. My analysis is slightly different, and we have to be careful. It's interesting. So you use the word non-dual. Now, really, Advaita is the traditional word. Now, if you look at the usage of non-dual, I would ask you to investigate the origin of the English use of non-dual. And if you look, for example, I don't know how accurate it is, but it seems to be, if you look at the use of non-dual in the West, on Google Ngram, for example, which is kind of indicative, goes like this, year 2000, up like this. So that tells me it goes up with other words, and we can chart this, postmodernism, it comes in. So I suggest to you just to consider this. I don't say it as a final thing or as a hypothesis.
Right.
That the misuse of some of the Indian spiritual traditions without adequately understanding the totality, and I'm talking about in the West in particular,
right,
supports the movement towards post-humanism. And as you're suggesting, if we look at Sri Aurobindo and the idea of the human not being the end of the evolution, fits in with Teilhard de Chardin, who I also have a big problem with, because the danger is that, well, it's not a danger for Teilhard de Chardin because it's clearly that was his belief, and he was with the Huxleys and all in that genre, but they want to physiologically change the human. I don't believe that that's what's meant to happen. Now, you might say, well, that's a very Christian idea about incarnation. Certainly, I do emphasize that, not from the Christian, but from a bigger perspective. But it's also in relation to the earlier traditions about, and the indigenous philosophies about the role of the human. It's also in that perennial philosophy about the human as a bridge between heaven and earth. And in particular, the human is a receptor. The human receives. Our capacity to receive will not be able to happen in this, whatever sophisticated environment. So there are two paths. I do not believe that this hyper technologized way will lead home. Now, to simplify where the descent, I believe in that descent. I believe in all the things, but there's different emphasis. And we go back to the work of Goethe in contrast with Newton. So Newton has this prism in a dark room, the light shines through, and there you see the spectrum. You see the 7 colors. And you say, okay, white light is made of. And Goethe says, well, that's not actually the way it happens in most normal contexts. This is not the way the light behaves. We have to look at the light. We have to be kind of non-dual, if you like, which is, a dual set of concepts, which always confuse me. I understand not two and all that, but we have to engage in a close relationship with the object and the subject. So that was his method, which was closer to the idea. And from that, he said, well, actually, if you look at in nature, a window and a light coming in, the spectrum appears between darkness and light. So you look at a rainbow, and when you know that the sun, you're looking at the rainbow, the sun is behind you, it's going to be dark on the far side. There's darkness on one side, there's light there, and the rainbow is revealed between. It's always between the light and darkness. It's an important construction. If you look, and I've talked about the mystery of the top light, every tradition says that we're made of light in some shape or form. I mean, it's there in all the traditions that this is our nature.
right.
So When Jesus says, "Ye are the salt of the earth," and then he goes on to say, "Let your light shine," there's two elements. There's the salt and there's the light. We see this in the Quran about crystals and light and earth. And we see this in a number of traditions. The link between the crystal and the light. So the crystal refers to, so the salt is the crystal. This is our structure. This is our physiological manifestation. There's a lot of liquid crystals in the body. This is known to all the traditions, that the significance of crystals, its importance in relation to resonation, resonance is important in relation to contact with distance, for example, the use of it in magic and spirituality. A reflection of the fact that we're crystals, we're receptors. Quartz is one of the most important substances in the war effort, for example, for communication systems. So we are receivers in this. But if you look at our origin, if you take one of the unacknowledged or the Gospels of Thomas, for example, where Jesus says, so this is not one of the standard ones, where Jesus says, if they ask you where you come from, say you came from the place that light came into being of its own accord.
Mm.
Okay? So in all the traditions, some say about divine darkness. I understand that because light in a particular way behaves or doesn't manifest itself in certain things. Doesn't mean it's not there. So if we see that the light is where we come from, but the light is also where we go back to, in all the traditions there's a return to somewhere, and there's a place that you don't want to go. That can't be ignored as well. But this has at a certain point, and all the fallen angel stories explain that there's a certain point where you can distance yourself from the light because you've taken, the light has been quenched in you. You don't have the capacity to go back to the thing. So if we see, for example, and this is not a Manichaean view or a dualistic view, but there are differences. If we consider that physical model as symbolic, as often a lot of these traditions say, these things, the sun represents something else. The rainbow is the zone of manifestation, is where we are enfleshed and where we exist in the fine-tuned universe,
Right.
and we have the capacity to return to the light, or to relinquish the light into a different zone. So there is that you have to consider the possibility that in all the traditions, the satanic realm, the devil, the fallen angel, the Azura, whatever, all those things are about context of choice made by original divine beings of light who decided no, for whatever reason, usually pride, hubris, whatever. So there's a gamble on that. There's a gamble, and the idea in post-humanism they refer to a lot to Indian philosophy, Indian spiritual tradition. It's all a game. It doesn't matter. That's
Right.
that's the implication. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. I don't believe in that. I believe in a deeper order, and I think you can certainly come to that conclusion. But if you come to the conclusion, and I wouldn't even, if you go back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is also used as well, or perhaps misused, say, well, therefore, military context doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a good soldier, or you know what I mean. That's okay and all that. Although that's not what Sri Aurobindo is saying when he's moving into a spiritual tradition. There's contradictions there, and that became the Gita became very important in militaristic societies in the West because it seemed to be a tradition that could be fit into. So I'm not sure that's what they're saying. So yeah, this is a big issue. This is a big issue. My intuition is that now again, I don't attend the Advaita or the non-dual things in the West. I don't want to tar it all the same brush. I have to be careful. But I'm listening to some of the analysis, and some of them seem to be formulaic. Some of them seem to not necessarily bring in the total of shaven giant, all the different strands, the Vedanta. They don't bring them all in necessarily, and I think we have to be careful about this issue. Do
Right.
you believe actually? Now you say so. Of course, if you believe in reincarnation and all this as the key thing, that actually it doesn't matter. Come back again or whatever like that. But what the great leaders, spiritual leaders, are talking about is to bypass a zone of repetition and a lower astral zone to go above that. What the
Right.
mystics, if you read Evelyn Underhill as a discipline from an Anglican perspective, who wrote about mysticism in a very deep way, she said you have to be careful in mystical things that all the mystics move from the lower astral dimensions of sensation into the higher ones. So a lot of experiences that people are seeking for sensations, because they have been so materially imprinted, they're fascinated with anything, even if it's the worst, the slums of the spiritual world. They are happy with that because it proves something. But there's a danger in taking that as the ultimate destination. Or if one is taking drugs to communicate with beings, and you don't understand what they're doing, you don't know that you're making a deal with them. For example, we don't know what the ontology of some of these beings are. They're
Right.
waiting for you and said, "We're delighted that you agreed to live with us for eternity when you go into the next world." So it is a big problem, and the my fear is that there has been, from the counterculture in the United States, even in London around the time of Coleridge, with the opium gang, if you like, of intellectuals, there has been a simplification, an oversimplification, and an appropriation of elements of Indian tradition, and that will suit the military-industrial complex. That's a real danger, that they take elements out of it, that they
Right.
appear to be what was a deeper tradition, and that we have to be careful about. I think the solution to it is to understand that when we get to the level of God, of course, everything below is a game and all, but we can't make that presumption. We can't
Right.
make we can't make the presumption. We can't be God. We can't get into God's mind and the mystery of that, and that's a mistake to believe that we can do. But we can follow perennial paths that lead us in the right direction, and the mystery is not something that we're going to be able to comprehend by definition, or it wouldn't be that which we
Right.
think it is. So that's what and my concern is that they, if I look in post-humanism, they're saying, oh, it's all a game, doesn't matter, so therefore post-humanism is okay. I believe there's something special in our construction. I
Mm.
believe that there is something fundamentally important about the human, with all the weaknesses, with all the problems, and I don't think that we're going to escape that. I think that the efforts to escape it is part of the problem. It's and when we're spoiling the world, which causes massive disease, for example, which makes the more difficult for the human to exist. When we're playing with the human mind, so people get more depressed when these systems are taken away the spirit, it can only end up collectively and individually in a bad. Yeah, so it does. You might call that Manichaean or whatever. It's not. I think there's a different emphasis that we have to be a bit careful, and it is a very important point and very important question.
Right. Right. I just want to quickly sort of zoom out a little bit um, and come to the other point. I know you mentioned we had this talk about UFOs and everything, but then one thing that keeps coming up in this talk is about beings and deities and other realms, and so what do you make of this whole alien UFO problem? Like, is it because this is something I'm personally interested in, and I believe that we're not alone in the universe, whether you think of it as alone in the physical universe or different dimensions, or however you look at it, because I believe like the world reality as we experience this is like a superposition of many different outcomes and possibilities in space and everything. So
Yeah.
like the whole idea of what is alien, is it from another planet, another realm, or whatever, it's all like it could be any and all of the combination of this thing. So I want to understand where do you stand on this thing, because clearly there are beings and entities, maybe disembodied, but still conscious, which sort of have their own realm, which have this interplay, and then they also interplay with humanity and affect. So what do you think of this whole phenomenon?
Where some of my skepticism comes from is accepting that, accepting we are surrounded by fleeting beings, for example, in my worldview. I find it difficult to understand why there would be such a preoccupation with other beings that are more tangible or that seem to be or whatever, or potentially, when all these beings are around us. So if, for example, you live in Sweden, take this example because it's becoming more relevant to me. And there's a tradition in the art of these trolls and beings that live in the forest. And the question I would ask to someone to consider without answering it is, was there some ontological reality behind these beings? Now, the same thing in relation to fairies in Ireland. If you believe in UFOs and don't believe in fairies, for example, I find that difficult. And we have the crossover because in my experience, and I don't talk much about these, but some of the beings that have been classified as demons are also the beings that are classified as aliens. And these are around us and they dwell in the same environment. So what I find strange is that there's a denial of all of those and an acceptance of all of these other things when people have made no effort to investigate the ontological reality. And you can only do that in a spiritual way, because when you're seeing some of these beings, it's in a half state. Like traditionally, if we look back at the Secret Commonwealth, the original one, the 1600s, describing the fairy realm by a Scottish minister, he said the best time to see these beings is at dusk, which is clearly the case. So at dusk, and there's physiological reasons that may explain that as well as other reasons. But our capacity to see is an art form, our capacity to perceive things. So so all of this fascination with whether there is somewhere in America a physical evidence of, it doesn't really change anything for me, because they still don't know about the beings which are around them. And
Right.
some of these beings are consistent with ideas of demons, or that can move in. And certainly there's different states of matters that we don't understand, and the plasmates and plasmoids, and all these kind of condensed kind of energy kind of formats that are there. And if we look at the coming race in 1870 and about the vril and the kind of split between an underground and overground culture, and kind of see it in H.G. Wells, we see an idea of a kind of some electrical kind of being or something. Now, these could be the reduced forms of another civilization that
Right.
we will end up as, for example, by being disembodied. These are the demonic realm could be approached by ways that we consider technological. So I have no problem, and I'm open to all the things on UFOs, subject to some provisos that throughout the history of this tradition that I'm criticizing, behind all this, the Navy was critical. So the Navy established a British Empire. So can you still hear me okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so John Dee, the magician, invoked the British Empire in the time of Queen Elizabeth. He was a magician interacting with the spirits, and he was the one. He was the one that helped with the Navy, with the conceptual structure. The Navy became critical. Trade, power over the seas,
Expansion.
transatlantic expansion, leading to telecommunications, communications, etc. The same structure. If we look at James Bond, if we look at Ian Fleming, they're all engaged in this secret intelligence. The Navy is critical. The Navy is the basis of a lot of stuff. So when I hear about what the Navy has said, I say, okay, yeah, grand, I understand that, but I'm also concerned that we can have the presentation of this threat which justifies globalization. Like it's been predicted by many. It's H.G. Wells. He wrote the script, about the War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Okay, when we have the Martians coming, so we must unite. There is this Independence Day, for example. Oh, let's join together. Give me more of your energy. All these aliens are going to kill you. So there is that game as well. We know that they wanted to use projections, and it's going to be difficult in the future to tell whether something is a projection or not. So, subject to that, there are all kinds of beings operating, and where they live and how they exist is difficult for us to, but they certainly do exist. There is no question about that. And a lot of the mystics are talking about those things. They're talking about similar things. But they're also, a lot of the mystics are not interested in a lot of these things. They're not
Right.
interested in the sensation of these things. They're not interested. And still, imagine in front of the White House, it all happens. In reality, we can touch it. Some big thing lands on the thing, and we have these guys there landing and say, here we are. Uh, it still doesn't change the obligation on us to continue on our spiritual path. It doesn't make any difference. In fact, the difference will be, it may be, if that scenario happened, is they say, you haven't been doing your spiritual evolution, boys and girls. You haven't been. You're not sufficiently. You're not sufficiently developed. What's going on here. Because I believe the future is spirit. You can be technological and spiritual, but the spiritual consciousness has to be first, because that's who we are.
Right.
So if you go back in the Irish legends, I mean, they're talking about the people, the original people coming from ships that landed on there's all this stuff. There's no question about that. If you look at the stories from the old people that were recorded by American scholars, Irish scholars, German scholars, there's different range of beings. They describe them. Ones that look like the grey,
Yeah.
ones that look like orbs of light, ones that looks
And
like noble,
giants.
tall people, giant, all that. It's all there. I've no problem with that. I believe in that. I also believe, actually, I had a vision, and I won't put any more than that. I can see spirits leaving Ireland, actually, ancient spirits leaving Ireland. Because if you don't engage with them, if you don't treat them as people used to do, even in a, linked up to Catholics, they still continue the holy wells, they still left out offering for fairies. If you don't regard them, uh, they're not going to stay. So people say, well, there was nothing there anyway. But actually, I
Mm.
believe, I literally believe that some ancient spirits are leaving places because people have ignored the possibility they can exist. And there's a bit of, like in, I don't get into quantum theory because people often misuse that in spiritual context, but like in the observer principle, uh, these figures need an observer too.
Right.
And if it's inconceivable that these things can exist, it's not inconceivable that they actually ontologically will depart. And I think that's happening because you can't have it both ways. You can't ignore the spiritual world, invest all your energy, as happened in the Celtic Tiger, in your, I understand that it's great people, the foreign holidays and all that. I don't begrudge that. I'm not saying, but at the expense of your spiritual thing, you have to be careful. If it's a clear trade off, you're trading something, you're ignoring all this, you're seeing all this stuff as superstitious, well, then there's a problem. And all of the things then solely become telescoped into a
Right.
particular story,
Right.
and we don't have the totality. So it'll be very, very difficult for people to tell whether these new things presented to them are genuine or not, and it's easy to fool the people. So what I would say is that I think that a lot of mystical leaders would accept the totality, a whole range of beings, but they would also accept that there's a hierarchy there, that they're not all equal and they're not all good. And the most traditions, most mystics, the real leaders are aiming to go to a zone of light, or if you want to call it lightness, which is the return to their original self, their true self. Uh, but there is another point in this. In a lot of Oriental traditions, the argument is that we're a drop and we come into the ocean and therefore
Yeah.
disappear. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that coherence disappears. I believe that we have resonance, but I don't believe that our coherence, spiritual thing, meant to disappear. And going back to the example of ye are the salt of the earth, Jesus goes on to say, so the salt being the crystal, in my view, the crystalline structure, but you can lose your saltiness and be trampled underfoot. So I believe that that was about, not about people. If you look at a lot of what the Christians say, and this means it's like soup and salt, and it's not about that. It's not about taste. It's saying that if you lose the structure that can contain consciousness, that can contain the spirit, that can receive and resonate with the divine, then you will lose the capacity
Hmm.
to contain it. And that would tie into the argument about I think the technology coming inside the body. Now, not inevitably, certain bits, but when it comes into your executive control, uh, as opposed to doing tricks, or for people that genuinely need it for medical reasons, I support all that. Great, that's fantastic. Put that aside. I'm talking about the mass involuntary forcing of technology to control people, because that's what I'm concerned about. If people want to do things to the body with technology, grand, that's great. I support them doing it, but don't force it on me.
Hmm.
So that's a different perspective.
Right. So, what is, in your opinion, the solution to our present predicament?
Yeah, the solution is spiritual evolution, and that primarily must be done on an individual level. The individual level then will force, or the drop will add. In that context, it does work. It will flow. So the spiritual consciousness must be developed. The solutions, the comprehension of the problems, the analysis require spiritual analysis. Or so consciousness for me is spiritual consciousness,
Right.
and that's associated the nature of your true self as opposed to your false self. And that true self is consistent with light in its being the constituent element, not the simple light, but the light that pervades all of being, of which this is a frozen manifestation in the zone of manifestation in the rainbow, if you like. So we have to develop individually. In so far as we are part of a tradition, accepting the value of the perennial traditions, the people in the traditions have to realize there's a threat to their tradition and to all traditions, and they're failing to do so. And if they fail to do so, if they are incapable of perceiving this threat, well, then there's a spiritually evolutionary context in that it doesn't work.
Hmm.
If they cannot see this problem, if they are unable, I don't care what other beings they can see, if they don't analyze properly what's happening around them, uh, and if they don't have the spiritual eyes to do so, it may be that leads to the disintegration of some of the traditions. It's very, very possible. So I don't want that. I don't want that heritage to be lost. But there's an onus on people now to be able to engage in all these discourse about UFOs, whatever, technology, science, philosophy, the whole lot, theology, culture, sociology, everything. And in that, to begin to see the space at the top where they can communicate with people of different traditions and begin to have that evolution at that thing. To explain to people the significance and value of spiritual evolution and the consequences of dispiriting, demoralization, and despair. And to be intelligent about that and to be open about that at the point. And when people commit themselves to a spiritual, it's critical in the hero's journey in the spiritual that you commit yourself to a path. If you don't commit, the siddhis, benefits, whatever you want to call them, the gifts of the spirit will not happen.
Right.
So associate with the gifts of the spirit are the ability to see things, the ability to perceive things, the ability to see what's happening in the future, the ability to operate in the world. And that was, of course, Maslow's pyramid. The people that were most successful, the self-actualized people, had mystical experience. That's the conclusion he came to. It works in the real world. So if a sufficient amount of people realize it, which I think will happen in the long term, they will also be inspired. And by inspired, it's the traditional mystical idea of intervention beyond. And we see this in science, scientists dreaming, about the periodic table, for example, or
Yeah.
Ramanujan in India, and mathematically getting the downloads. This thing
Srinivasa
becomes
Ramanujan.
habitable.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. In relation to, and Yeats had that idea as well. This was his idea of the magic. We are the individual mind. There is the great mind. The individual connects with the great mind through symbols. So we have to use all these techniques. But in that, I do think the notion of evolution implies that you're moving somewhere. There is a movement. The choices, the choices about, say, physical form cannot happen before one has spiritually evolved. There may be some time in the future when we've gone through a process after a deadly destructive process where some of the options may be important. Most of the ideas of changing the human were in anticipation of them moving into space. The reason why they wanted to move into space was to have a space colony for the elite to live in. So a lot of it is not really true. A lot of it, they don't care about your evolution. They're not interested in helping you physically evolve. They're not interested in helping. That's all a lie. They're interested in selective things which will benefit them. They will still take your organs if you want. They won't have any moral structure in it. So a lot of that is a big lie which supports this movement. They've told us space exploration, intelligence increase, life expansion. That was associated. That was the 1920s Britain, supported by Russian cosmism. All that it comes from the same principle. So spiritual evolution, spiritual consciousness. So it is only from doing things, whether it be yoga or a prayer to the Virgin Mary in a Catholic thing, or understanding what these phenomena are, or understanding these. It's only from people doing the well-established and well-connected spiritual things that we can move to the next level, and that's where spiritual evolution will come from. And we will be able to deal with these issues. But there is a big spiritual war, and some traditions will be found wanting. Some institutions have already been found wanting and not fit for purpose. So there is going to be radical change anyway. But spiritual consciousness has to assert itself non-violently in an imaginative way, demonstrating its ability to understand the world as well, not avoiding all these issues, engaging with the technology as well. So spiritual evolution is the key. That was the starting point of me coming on this path again to try and explain what I thought was important. It was a kind of locution, if you like, that I received, which said that there has been a certain failure of spiritual evolution, and it began to take me back and say, really, is that where all the problems come from? And yes, is the answer after a lot of studies. And it's difficult to convince some people about the reality of spiritual consciousness. You have to demonstrate it. You have to engage in it. You have to exemplify it. You have to live it. You have to practice it. You have to believe in it. You have to communicate with people of goodwill everywhere. You have to find your common bonds, re-establish viewpoints, change your viewpoints sometimes. So that's the modus, a kind of pragmatic cosmopolitan perspective in that. To talk to people in different countries, to learn, to discuss these things, through that dialogue, to perfect your own view, to re-articulate them, to find synthesis, to see, is there some point we've missed? Is there some point in that analysis about the non-duality where actually the previous people have told us that don't confuse this with this point because it looks the same. There are subtleties that we must engage in, and nuance. There's skills that we have to apply in this argumentation. So spiritual evolution, that's the answer.
Right. And it's interesting you came to that point about your realization, because that was going to be my closing question. How did you come onto this path?
There was a lot of little things. There was a few key points. Going back to Ireland, I was always interested in spirituality. Being brought up Catholic, there was a lot of spirituality for people that wanted it, and there was a very strong indigenous tradition as well. And it is indigenous culture, an ancient tradition which I had the end of, the access to the end of it. So that was there. And I did read about yoga I remember my sister had a book on yoga. I said, what's this? And there wasn't any around me reading about yoga. But I could say, yeah, that's good. I could immediately, there was I don't know who it was, a fellow with pictures doing all the moves and explaining. And I said, yeah, they're sound. So I used to, teach myself in that area, and try and open to Taoism. And then I went into that world and concentrating on law and teaching law and seeing what was happening in globalism and seeing how these institute and seeing what they were and working with various countries and international bodies and getting a sense of what was happening. And then at the time of the Iraq War, I said, well, hold on a second. This stuff is what they're saying. The principles there don't match with the reality. It does. It just doesn't. That's a big lie. And for a number of reasons, had a family and said, okay, I'm going to concentrate on. I'm going to leave that. It's not true. I'm going to concentrate on. Gandhi was a barrister as well, though, of course,
Yeah.
people forget about.
Yeah.
So that's important in relation to the discipline of what you're dealing with. So then I went to paint, to concentrate on spiritual things, to look after my children, and then the mystical thing came back in the intervention sense. So it wasn't that I was consciously thinking about any of that. It began to appear in the interventions. It had. I have to say one point. I did have. I do have a series of dreams but I don't remember any of them. I just know that they were there, and it's like every time there's a curtain closed or there's a word left, and it's the end of it. So this happens in a spiritual thing as well. You're not actually told directly cognitively what you have been told. You don't know yourself, but this is a thing that's underestimated. But I get a lot of that, and particularly in the hypno pompic state, and when you wake up, it's clear you've just landed on the beach, but you can still have something from the craft of the revelation. And you know that they're powerful because they affect you physiologically. You know it's a deep cleansing, whatever. And some of them were associated, like I noticed in retrospect, the Virgin Mary, for example, or perennial symbols like the rose garden. I said, well, what's that rose garden? I knew that's all I had, the rose garden. And then you get seeds of remainders because you're not meant to get the whole thing. And so you wouldn't be able to proceed if you got the whole thing. If you know it's magnificent, but the curtain has to be because you're in a different environment that
Right.
doesn't lend itself to operation. So a series of things happen, but the mystical accord, the first line and the subsequent lines, seems to come on the wind. They didn't seem constructed. I didn't seem, and I understand the subconscious, I understand all that, but they seemed to me to be external. I'm not saying they were inconsistent with my belief system. So you can argue there's another part of you articulating the thing. It can be, or a teacher, or whatever. There's different ways of articulating. But in relation to my cognitive processes, they seem to come. And I followed it, and I began to write it down, the things that came. And then I said, how does this match with the traditions? So I looked through all the traditions and began to see the similarities in the perennial tradition about the self, starting out with the self and the true self, all this kind of stuff. And you see the same pattern in all the things if you look in the right places. And then subsequently the emphasis on light. I will talk about water at some time in the future. The same things. They're all there. You can't avoid them if you begin to open up. So you see it in Christian terms. Jesus talks about preparing the field. That's what you have to do. You have to prepare the field, and you do that if you're doing something like yoga, and that you open up your capacity, and then the things are planted, the seed is planted, but
Right.
it doesn't come from you. The seed
Yeah.
doesn't come from you, and this is what the reality of the mystical tradition is. So
So in a way, you sort of prepare for the divine to descend, for the
absolutely,
divine.
I don't have I have no other way of understanding the world except in all the traditional ways that spirit, even in the Greek, Roman, spirit came into the flesh, and that was a descent. And for whatever reason, different explanations of it, it comes into this vessel, and that vessel is unique for this context, for this to deal in this and to retain the connection. And it's not something that should be oversimplified. And all the traditions of the origin is the descent from light into crystallized being in a fine-tuned universe is what we're experiencing. The point is, you want to return, and whether some people regard it as a test, I think it's oversimplified. It's in our nature to return. Like if you hold a ball underwater, it's going to come out.
Right.
What you have to be careful about is that if it's compromised, the ball, if someone stabs it and air gets in, it won't come up. And so it's like the last symbol. Uh, every spiritual tradition points you to water as the key thing. So we know water is hugely complex. They don't understand the structure of water yet, and there's people. I know that from talking to people in the defense forces. They haven't cracked it yet, which is quite amazing. But if we say that we know about hydrogen and oxygen, or the two molecules in it, in some ways, in all of these things, there's always a layer of meaning that's applicable from these insights, from the basic things. So I liken it to that in the spiritual world we're water. Then in this environment we have to split into our two atoms, or our two elements,
Right.
but we have to unite. We have to unite them in order to proceed back. So the objective of the dark forces is to maintain the split. And if you
Separation.
like to say one of them is the body and one of them is the spirit, convince you that actually you're only this thing and the other thing is gone. You cannot. It becomes difficult for you to return to your original being. I know it's a simple analogy, but it's something like that. It's something. The nature of this reality gives us great possibilities to evolve in a social, humanitarian way, a hard way, to apply those, to translate the light into actuality in this fine-tuned universe. That this is the rules of the game, if you like. And but
Right.
our objective is to return to it. So yes, that there's no spiritual tradition that really doesn't have. When we say some, they grow up from the earth, or we're expressions of the earth and all that. That's often associated with Terence McKenna, if you like, and he has a kind of similar thing, and some of the Gaia things. It leads to a different conclusion, because it forgets this, which was traditionally the father element, the father light and the mother earth thing. There was a duality
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that sense, which forms the.
Yeah. 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 So I was gonna end here, but since you brought up the idea of father skies, something came to my mind, because in the Sanskrit tradition, you know how in the ancient world there were influences between Greek and Sanskrit and Vedic religions and so on. It's interesting mention, because there's the idea of sky father. So the Sanskrit word is dhyaus for sky, and father is pittar. So the combined word was dhyaus pittar for sky father, and prithvi, for mother, right, which is earth. And human beings are supposed to be like come out of the union of
Which
these two. It's interesting, because dhyaus pittar is cognate with Jupiter and Zeus. Dyaus is cognate with
yes,
Zeus. And so it's like this pantheon of deities from the ancient Vedic, Rig Vedic, and Sanskrit. It sort of seems to match with like the Greek and all these other concepts. So I just thought I'll throw in concluding comments,
okay.
how there's
Last
this
point.
again.
Yeah, you're a bit Irish there in the way your conversation going on. Yeah, yeah, that's good. So uh, yes, and in the story of the evolution of man in the Roman tradition, we have there's a dispute between the earth, Tellus, Care, who formed man out of the earth, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so, who is human? The human ultimately is associated with the care, but because that was the creator, meaning the compassionate sense. So it's even there in the Roman thing. So the earth says, yeah, but we'll get back the body because that belonged to me. That's fair enough. We don't think that this is the thing, but it's a necessary component. Um, Care can have it in this environment, but they go back to Jupiter and Saturn. So that's there in the thing. And in the Irish, there's a building that I got the permission to be in a few years ago. It's very difficult to get in now. New Grange, at least 5,000 years old. And on the 21st day of December every year, the sun, the shortest day of the year, comes over the horizon at an extreme point in the sky. It shines in through a roof box, up a passage into the centre of this mound that was built 5,000 years ago, just on that day, and a little bit the day before and after. So they built that, in my view, to show two things. That this was if you like, the same as in the Bushmen of the Kalahari. It's this sky father mating with the Mother Earth, the mound, the
Right.
womb, all that kind of stuff. But it's also another thing. When you're in there, you are establishing a direct connection backwards. So
Hmm.
this is the narrow path, or the straight path. This is the path back to the source.
The
So
direct path.
it's reminding you, it comes around, but it also brings you back home. It's reminding you where you come from, and it's also light. And this is the same tradition we have remarkably reflected in the dating of Christmas and light and the sun and all this kind of stuff. So they built on, not copied. They emanated from a deep, common, perennial pool that understood these things
Hmm.
and are utterly consistent in the thing. So you can't have one without the other. So you can't have the earth without this light, and you can't have you can't have us without both. So they're remarkably consistent, and I have gone back to the Sanskrit to look at these origin of words many times, and I have referred to them because they're critical in relation to understanding the conceptual framework. It's a fantastic access to a different way or an old way of thinking embedded in the language, as Irish was, but as is under pressure, it's losing that. So yes, there's a great commonality, and they all come to similar things, but we cannot ourselves become the Mother Earth, and we cannot become the Sky Father. And we're trying to do that now with geoengineering and all this going up in the clouds, creating the mechanical cloud. It's an attempt to become gods. It's a Promethean, Titanic attempt to come like Zeus, the cloud gatherer. They're doing it. So they're saying, okay, well, those gods were replaced in Greece. It's our time now. We're
Right.
becoming gods. We can do with the people what we want to do. But the real God won't tolerate that. And how that will play out, again, it's not up to us to be able to predict that, but we can predict that it will happen. There is the question is, what damage can be inflicted before the world rights itself? That's the question.
Right. So on that note, I think we should sort of wrap up for the day. I mean, there's tons of things to talk about. I wrote down a whole lot of things, but I don't think we'll have time
Great.
for any of that. So, James, thank you so much for a fascinating chat, and hopefully, maybe we'll do this at some point in the future, discuss a lot of other
Yeah.
things. Thank
It
you
was
so
a
much.
great pleasure to talk to you, Ramesh, and good luck with your spiritual journey and your yoga. And I think it's very, very important to have these conversations, to find the nuances, to reflect me too on the nuances, to try and find the little distinctions that can become important as we move to the next level. It's in those details that we will answer or become more aware, learn, and so I appreciate the platform, the opportunity to talk to you, and it's been a real pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you so much, James.